This is Kate at the Library of Whispers. Now, I have just spent a week in Scotland. I know you didn't know I was away because I pre-recorded some videos, but now I am back and I had a fantastic time. Thank you. So, I thought I would have a little look through this booklet. It's Ghosts, Massacres and Horror Stories of Scotland's Castles, because we are so close to Halloween. And I've got my cauldron candle over here. This is a new one. And the scent is, I think it was violet and something. Yeah, I can't remember now, but it's, I think cherry, maybe. But the wax is kind of like a very, very dark red, black colour. It's nice. Anyway, so I thought this would fit the theme. Now, I bought this booklet in a charity shop, gosh, quite a while ago actually, and I have read some of the stories from it. It's got some actual pictures of Scottish castles on the back, and on the front you can see them. And it's by Margaret Campbell, illustrated by John McKay. And in the introduction it says there are over 1,200 castles in Scotland, each with a different story to tell of clan feuds, treachery and bloodshed, betrayal, hatred, rivalry and love. From the imposing fortress that dominates Princes Street in the capital, that's Edinburgh, to the ivy-covered walls of Castle Camas in Skye, from ruined Rothsay, set in the middle of the town, to isolated Tyram and even more distant Knowlterland in Orkney, each played its part in the turbulent history of the nation. The medley of ghosts range from the heartbroken lady mourning her lost lover to the malevolent, cursing laird who, through sheer malice, will not let his descendants live in peace. A few of the ghosts are lonely, sad, unhappy and harmless creatures, but some strike as much terror into folk who meet them today as they did to those who encountered said to be the largest inhabited mansion in Britain. It's a magnificent 18th century building begun in 1721 for the first Duke of Roxburgh and remodelled in the next century by Playfair into the impressive castle it is today. The best view of the castle is from the golden gates erected early in this century in the wall which surrounds the huge estate, and part of which was built by French prisoners of war from the Napoleonic conflict. The dukedom takes its name from one of the mightiest fortresses of the Middle Ages, Roxburgh Castle. The whole area around Kelso was one of the first to suffer when the English invaded, as they so often did. Sorry about that. Between the 12th and 16th centuries, the town which grew up around the fortress was a thriving community, one of the first 4 royal boroughs of Scotland, and a borough was usually created as a place of strength. The Royal Mint of an earlier century was sited in Roxburgh, so important a town was it. Yet all that remains today is a tiny hamlet and a green mound with a few stones, not one on top of another, to show where this once mighty stronghold lay. Needless to say, the castle was as often in English hands as in Scots. Some of the best known tales of the wars of independence are centred on Roxburgh. When Edward I captured the Bruce ladies at Gildrummy, Bruce's sister suffered the same fate as Isabel of Buchan. Only the cage in which she was confined was at Roxburgh Castle, while Lady Isabel's cage was at Berwick. In the skirmishes leading up to Bannockburn, the story of Douglas's capture of Roxburgh Castle has gone down in the annals of history. It being Shrove Tide, the soldiers were celebrating, although keeping a wary eye open for attack, for Douglas was rumoured to be in the vicinity. The wife of one of the garrison sat on the ramparts rocking her baby. She noticed movements in the green fields surrounding the castle. "It's the farmer's cattle," was the indifferent reply when she asked what it was. Hush ye, do not fret ye, the Black Douglas shall not get thee," she caroled, the popular lullaby of the day. "Don't be so sure about that," said a deep voice, and a heavy mailed hand descended on her shoulder. Douglas and his men had camouflaged themselves in black capes and crawled slowly forward to give the impression of wandering cattle, then quickly scaled to the walls and surprised the garrison. The lady and her baby were spared. The castle changed hands several times after that, and in 1460 was in the hands of the English. James II determined to retake it. He besieged the castle and proudly brought forward a recent invention, the cannon. The cannon burst and James died. His widow hastened to the scene and inspired the army to attack and gain her husband's objective. Knowing it would be difficult to hold the castle, they razed it to the ground. The lands were granted to the Kerrs of Cessford in the 16th century, and when Sir Robert Kerr was raised to the peerage, he took the title Lord Roxburgh. From him the Dukes of Roxburgh descended. Their magnificent castle of floors faces the ruined Roxburgh Castle, from which the title is derived. In the extensive grounds of floors is a holy tree set to mark the spot where James II was killed, and in this area a ghostly figure of a mounted warrior has been seen riding towards the ruins of Roxburgh. Floor's castle has its own ghost. He troubles no one, but just lingers around outside the main door. He is said to be a former gardener of the estate who was very attached to an earlier duchess. Okay, let's read this one. Why Piper's hands were cut off. Duntroon Castle, the 9-mile-long Crinan Canal, designed by John Rennie, was opened in 1801 Those who were left turned and fled to swim to safety across the river, but even there their foes were waiting. As the Cummings scrambled up the bank, they were clubbed to death. Only Alistair and 4 companions managed to escape and took refuge in a cave. Murray wasn't content with winning the battle. He marched on Dunvale Castle and laid siege to it. As the days went past, the castle's inmates were starving. Somehow Alistair and his companions managed to smuggle meal in, but on one of their sorties were traced back to their hideout in the cave. Murray and a few followers pursued them, ignoring the Cummings' pleas to be allowed to come out and die by the sword. Murray continued to heap brushwood at the mouth of the cave and set fire to it. Alistair and his 4 loyal companions were smoked to death. Legend maintains that their heads were then cut off and flung over Dunvale Castle wall with the taunt, "Here's beef for your bannocks." The weakened garrison made one more effort to escape, but were cut to pieces. About the beginning of the 18th century, when a green mound near the castle was being dug up, 5 headless bodies were found. Headless ghosts are said to be seen haunting the ruins of the castle, and often the clash of steel is heard accompanied by groans of dying men. Let's see, what else do we have? Let's have a look at this one. The Drummer of Death, Garth Castle. Visitors to Kirriemuir in search of the birthplace of J.M. Barrie, author of Peter Pan, will find themselves not only at the gateway to some of the lovely glens of Angus, but also in the heart of Ogilvie country. When Princess Alexandra married the Honourable Angus Ogilvie in 1963, she was allying herself with a family that can trace its ancestry back 1,000 years and more to Pictish times. After Scotland became a united country, Ogilvie ancestors emerged as the first Earls of Angus. Their name and lands came into the family as a reward from a grateful William the Lion, when the then outlawed Earl of Angus came to his aid when the king was attacked while hunting in the area. From then, the Ogilvies were some say, for philandering with the Earl's wife. Others claim he intrigued with an attacking enemy and allowed them to approach with it without beating out his warning to the inmates of the castle. There he is, the drummer was thrown from the castle tower. The early monument in Glen Clover, seen 4 miles around, was erected in memory of the 11th Earl who was killed in action in the Boer War, one occasion on which the drum was heard. Let's go a bit further. Let's read this one. Time to call my hounds. Garth Castle. Of all the characters who rampaged their way through Scotland's history, none was more notorious than the great-grandson of Robert the Bruce, Alexander Stewart, nicknamed the Wolf of Badenoch. Not content with the many strongholds he already possessed, when more land came his way in Perthshire, he built another castle, now known as Garth Castle, but in his day often called Castle a Gwilion Curta, Castle of the excommunicated puppy or accursed whelp, for these were other nicknames bestowed on him when he was excommunicated for pillaging and burning Elgin Cathedral. The Stewarts of Garth, who inherited the castle from their notorious ancestor, were the offspring of his liaison with his mistress, or one of them at any rate. As was their custom, the Stewarts of Garth kept up a running feud with their neighbours, with an acquisitive eye on nearby Glen Lyon, I think that is. Towards the end of the 15th century, their opportunity came. In 1488, the MacIvors were strong in the Glen. Their chieftain put to death a man they caught raiding their land. Unbeknown to them, he was the well-loved foster brother of Stewart of Garth. Stewart gathered his men and marched. When they reached the Glen, his men took cover while he went on alone, his dark green plaid wrapped around him. He and the MacIvor chief met and talked on top of a rock, still pointed out to this day. Suddenly there was a rustling in the bushes. Only a herd of my roes frisking among the rocks, explained MacIvor too horridly. Then it's time for me to call my hounds, said Stewart grimly. He threw off his plaid, turning it to the red side, so the red side was showing. His men recognised the signal. The hidden warriors of both sides emerged from cover, but the MacIvors were no match for the Stewarts. In 1499, Neil Stewart succeeded as Laird of Garth. He earned himself the nicknames Young Wolf and Neil the Doomed. His particular bête noire was Sir Robert Menzies. When he heard Sir Robert had built a new castle at Weem Hill near Aberfeldy, he gathered his caterans together and descended on it. Sir Robert's new castle was set on fire, and he himself imprisoned in the dungeon at Garth, where the young wolf threatened to starve him to death unless he signed over certain lands to the Stewarts. Fortunately for Sir Robert, news of his plight was swiftly carried to the king. James IV angrily ordered his release and compensation to be paid. Only the first was adhered to, but that was only the beginning of Neil's reign of terror. Some 40 years later, he took a scunner at his wife, Mariota. Ostensibly her death in the ravine below the castle walls was caused by an accidental blow on the head by a stone thrown by one Alexander Stewart, but tradition persists